Firstly, apologies for my voice, I've got a bit of a cold. Shortly after the Japanese Grand Prix, one of the most powerful storms on record lashed the northeast coast of the US. An extratropical cyclone absorbed Hurricane Grace in what would later become known as the Perfect Storm, the title of a book and subsequent movie about the sinking of the fishing boat Andrea Gale, whose 6-man crew made up nearly half of the total 13 deaths caused by the storm. It affected the weather fronts across North America and also resulted in a severe snowstorm in the Midwest with 8 inches of snow falling on Minneapolis-St. Paul on Halloween, bringing down power lines and leaving as many as 100,000 people without power or heating as temperatures plummeted to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 23 Celsius. In all, 22 people died, a larger death toll than the more famous Perfect Storm. Poland held its first free parliamentary election since 1928. The Solidarity Trades Union movement, which had been instrumental in the fall of the communist government back in 1989, had splintered politically, and the votes were predictably split too, with the Democratic Union taking 62 seats and the Democratic Left Alliance 60, while the satirical Beer Lovers Party polled over 350,000 votes and ended up with 16 seats in the same. After 2 months of horse trading, President Lech Wałęsa brokered a deal whereby Jan Olszewski of the Centre Agreement formed a minority government supported by the other centrist and centre-left minority parties. No fewer than 111 parties had taken part, something that contributed both to the inability of anyone to form a majority and to the disillusionment with democracy that had led to the relative success of the Beer Party. And on November the 6th, 3 days after the Australian Grand Prix, Boris Yeltsin officially banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from the Russian Federation and appropriated all its assets to the Russian state. President Gorbachev had already taken steps to limit the powers of the party within the USSR generally after the August coup, and this latest move seemed to confirm the death of European communism. On December the 1st, Ukraine's independence referendum passed overwhelmingly, and a week later the leaders of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine met in a forest on the Belarus-Poland border to officially dissolve the Soviet Union and establish instead the Commonwealth of Independent States, a looser federation that would be open to all current Soviet republics to join, but they would be able to leave at any time. On Christmas Day, Gorbachev resigned as Soviet president, and the Supreme Soviet met one last time to agree on the dissolution, adjourn itself forever, and declare that the USSR would officially cease to exist on December the 31st. Alain Prost's frustrated comments to the media after the Japanese Grand Prix, filtered through the unfavourable Italian sporting press, had provided Ferrari with the excuse they needed to finally end the ongoing saga by sacking the Frenchman, effective immediately, not just cancelling his 1992 contract, so the triple world champion and winningest driver in F1 was out on his ear with no drive for 1992, let alone Australia 1991. Guy Ligier could hardly suppress a broad grin, and neither could Gianni Morbidelli, who was drafted in to drive the number 27 Ferrari at Adelaide. Ivan Capelli was still hovering around and available, but it was all a bit last minute and they hadn't had chance to do a seat fitting, so established test driver Morbidelli got the nod. That left a seat free at Minardi, which was gratefully snaffled by Roberto Moreno, pulling on his 3rd set of overalls this season. Meanwhile, Moreno's old friend Nelson Piquet had confirmed that this would be his 204th and last Grand Prix, and celebrated by snarking at Mansell's throwing away of the title in Japan. Quote, "One day Williams will have to distinguish between those who have won 3 world titles and those who have lost 3. With Eric Bernard still hors de combat with a broken ankle, a grateful Bertrand Gachot suited up in Larousse's multicoloured overalls, and with Naoki Hattori reprising his role at what will be Coloni's last race, the grid was otherwise the same as Suzuka. It was looking like it would be very different at the first race of 1992, though, with Coloni sold, the Modena Lamborghini outfit closing up shop, and big question marks over Fond Metal, as well as the veteran British Brabham and Tyrrell teams. Dennis Nursey of Middlebridge had told Brabham's employees that they should look for other options, and Sergio Rindland had already departed. However, Nursey had also confirmed that the team did intend to start the 1992 season with Eric van der Poel and Japanese Formula 3000 pilot Akihiko Nakaya on driving duties. Without sponsors, drivers or engines in place for 1992, Tyrrell also looked like they were in trouble. Even Harvey Postlethwaite and Mike Gascoigne had gone, poached by Peter Zauber as the Swiss manager was also eyeing up an F1 project. Tyrrell had been in that situation before, to be sure. Ken seemed to have to rebuild from scratch about every other year during the early 80s, but he was 67 now and was beginning to think about retirement. Sure, his sons were doing most of the day-to-day these days, but the rumour was that Ken was looking for $9 million for the team as a going concern, though he would keep assets like the wind tunnel and factory. One name linked with the team was a familiar one to old Tyrrell fans, Stewart. Sir Jackie's son Paul had a successful F3000 team and was rumoured also to have his eye on Formula One. But that would all sort itself out over the season break. For now, there was one more race to run. Wiliams had brought along an amended FW14 with a new system designed by Paddy Lowe. Active suspension, like the semi-automatic gearbox, a system that Nigel Mansell hadn't had a great experience of in the past. It was given a run out in practice and seemed to do okay, but with the Constructors' Championship still on, the passively sprung car would be run for qualifying in the race. But first pre-qualifying, which took place on Thursday to expand the weekend to 4 days. Once again, the Brabhams went through, and were hoping to avoid PQ next year with their 3 points. They were joined by the 2 footworks, while Tarquini's suspension failed and pitched him into a wall, and Hattori was still getting the hang of car, circuit and sport, and was over 5 seconds off the pace, the Coloni team thus failing to pre-qualify at every race this year. Friday and Saturday's main qualifying took place in bright sunshine and with a fair few shunts and spills. It was an entertaining session for the spectators, which ended up with another McLaren front row lockout. Senna taking his 60th career pole ahead of Berger, who was suffering from a tummy bug and saying he didn't think he was going to get through the race anyway, with Mansell and Patrese lining up behind. Piquet would begin his last Grand Prix from 5th place ahead of his upstart teammate Schumacher, with the Ferraris back in 7th and 8th. Gianni Morbidelli ironically starting for Ferrari in the same slot he'd started for Minardi last time out. Stefano Modena began his last race for Tyrrell in 9th alongside Martini, rounding out the top 10. The Dellaras in their last race before taking those Ferrari engines off Minardi were 11th and 13th, sandwiching De Cesaris. Alboreto did well in 15th and Blundell 17th, and in the last hurrah for the Modena boys, Nicola Larini did really well to line up 19th, just alongside Moreno in the Minardi. Caffey qualified the other footwork too, and Karl Wendlinger just squeaked onto the back of the grid by a 10th, lining up alongside Hakkinen and extending Aguri Suzuki's unwanted DNQ record to 4 in the last 6. Aguri was joined by Martin Brundle, who'd struggled with a brake problem and failed to qualify for the first time since 1985, and 2 of the 3 Belgians, Martin's replacement Van der Poel and the unfit and rusty Bertrand Gachot. The weather forecast for Sunday didn't look too good though. A mini tornado was threatened with the airport closed and heavy rain forecast. It held off for the morning warm-up, but the heavens opened during the touring car support race at lunchtime, and the rain was so heavy the track was quickly drenched. It had rained in 1989 too, of course, but this was even worse. 2 more years of urban traffic had produced deep ruts along the Brabham Strait, which hampered drainage, and the rain was even harder. There was talk of the drivers refusing to start in the monsoon conditions.
This is almost a repeat of 1989.
Yeah, what do you think of it?
I think it's terrible.
It is really bad. We were so unlucky. I mean, it's such a nice place, nice people, and we come here to have a good time, to have a good race, and look at the weather. It's, I mean, really bad.
When I look outside now, I look at the pit lane and see the amount of surface water. It's exactly the same as 1989.
Yeah, it's probably worse now. It's raining really hard now. Well, that's, I think, everything that we have to delay the start or cancel the race, I think. I mean, it's really bad at the moment. I don't think we'll be able to drive in these conditions safely anyway.
Yeah, it looks as if they're going down in the... it's exactly a repeat of 89, because I remember the total confusion. Do you think now that they should take a decision to delay the start a little?
Well, I don't know. We have to look outside. I haven't gone around yet. Here in the pit lane looks terrible, and it looks like it's not possible to race, but we have to see. We have to see. Nobody's run on the wet so far here this weekend, so it's another problem.
Do you think they should maybe give you 10 minutes run round in the rain?
Yeah, it came just too late because we had this 15 minutes practice allowed at 1 o'clock. It was dry at 1 o'clock. So I don't know what's going to happen now.
Yeah, maybe if the team managers made a representation that they should give 10 minutes run round in the rain.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I think the race director is conscious of the problem, and we'll see.
But with the global TV audience waiting, Bernie persuaded the waverers and the race organisers to go ahead. Ayrton Senna, though, privately asked Roland Brunschreiter and race director Tim Schenken to stop the race if he signalled, promising he'd only do so if the conditions were genuinely unsafe. Needless to say, everyone began the race on wet tyres, though after a fuel problem on his race car, Schumacher was forced to switch to the spare, which was set up for the dry, so he'd be having a fun afternoon trying to stay pointing forward. Off they went for the parade lap, and even at this low speed it was immediately apparent just how bad visual conditions were going to be, not to mention the giant puddles on the straight. The green light came on and everyone tiptoed off the line, Senna leading Berger, twitching wildly as Patrese spun his wheels and dropped back, and everyone else disappeared into a wall of grey. The Benettons had both got past Patrese and were behind Mansell as they gingerly made their way around lap 1, hoping to squeegee some of the water off the circuit in the first few laps and be able to race properly after that. Unseen among the spray, Patrese had dropped back behind Morbidelli's Ferrari, while Schumacher made his way past Piquet despite struggling for grip. On lap 3, missed by the cameras in the murk, Berger had a spin and rejoined between Mansell and Schumacher, and soon had the young German looking for a way past too. Even Senna was twitching around all over the place, and with 26 cars on the track, it was amazing they had somehow been 4 laps without a major accident, as Mansell continued charging, getting right on Senna's tail as close as he could while still having some visibility. It was Schumacher's turn to spin, rejoining behind Piquet and ahead of Alesi, while Nakajima went off at the first chicane, his second incident of the race already, and declared discretion the better part of valour, and ended his F1 career on something of a damp note. The conditions were taking no prisoners, as Piquet elegantly pirouetted across the curbs, rejoining right ahead of Schumacher, who was still showing the exuberance of youth and was immediately all over his teammate again. In another incident missed by the cameras, Schumacher tried to take Piquet down the Brabham straight, spun, and was T-boned by Alesi, putting both cars out and scattering debris across the track. Larini arrived, aquaplaned into the Ferrari that Alesi had just vacated, and ricocheted into the other wall. The leaders came round to enter the straight, and Mansell dove out from behind Senna, only to quickly tuck back in again as he saw cars littering the track. Yellow flags were out, and many expected to see the red, but no dice. The race continued as 1989 winner Boutsen pulled off with a cracked wishbone caused by an earlier incident with Nakajima. So after 6 laps, the order was Senna leading Mansell by about a second and a half, with Berger third about 4 seconds back, then Piquet another 14 seconds behind the Austrian, and Patrese and Morbidelli scrapping, now over 5th and 6th. Course cars and trucks ventured out onto the Brabham straight to try and tow cars off the racing line, while Senna was already catching the last of the backmarkers in the bright blue shape of Eric Comas, tiptoeing around in the evil-handling Ligier in his first taste of such conditions in F1. As the marshals continued trying to clear the straight, the rain seemed to be getting worse, and lap times were now 4 seconds slower than the first lap. Senna disposed of Blundell and Moreno, but before he could lap the other Minardi of Martini, the little Italian's car snapped right and slammed into the wall on the Brabham straight, bouncing off and shedding bits of nose all over the track and nearly collecting Caffey in the process. The footwork driver, in his last race for the team, had seen Martini go off right in front of him and was doggedly sticking to the racing line lest he find another unexpected puddle, so he was now balking Senna, allowing Mansell to catch right up, especially as there were still yellow flags waving down the main straight, which rather limited overtaking options. Eventually Senna got through, as did Mansell, just on lap 12. Mansell was still trying to get past Senna and out of his spray, and despite the awful conditions, he was absolutely determined to get through. It was thrilling stuff, when you could see it, with Senna having eased off just to finish in the conditions and Berger now catching the leading pair too. Patrese, meanwhile, had picked up a chunk of somebody else's front wing under his bodywork, which wasn't helping his cause any as he continued fighting to keep Morbidelli behind him. On lap 16 the rain got heavier yet, the clouds so heavy that it looked like the lights had been turned out as the spray intensified once again. As the cameras struggled to find anything to look at, a spinner was spotted in the background. It was Mansell, who'd hit the wall with a thump and, dazed, was still sat in his cockpit. He was the first but not the last. Alboreto ended up sideways, Berger did a double 360, and Modena a single one before Berger aquaplaned again and went straight into a wall. Senna was now waving to race control as he passed, and shortly afterwards the red flag came out and the race was called to a stop. The question was whether it would be restarted or stopped entirely. Senna and Patrese both went up to race control to make their thoughts known. Out came a series of 10-minute boards, but after an hour or so the race was finally called off. Positions would be at the end of lap 14, with half points awarded. It was the shortest F1 race in history, which was won by Ayrton Senna, with Mansell second, Berger third, Piquet fourth, Patrese fifth and Morbidelli sixth. Pirro, the Jordans and Moderners made up the top 10, but 20 cars had been classified after such a short race. It had been a pretty shambolic affair all told, and probably should have just been called off before it started. McLaren had a muted celebration of winning the constructors' title that they had been pretty certain of before the race started, while Mansell was checked out in hospital but released with no ill effects. After the race, Senna talked to the media, saying that he and Berger had agreed that they'd take to the track to help the team win the constructors' title, but that Ron had left the final decision to him once the race started. He also reflected on how much he'd changed since the wet race of 1989, when he'd insisted on starting despite the protestations of the others. He thought he'd matured as a person, and having apparently buried the hatchet with Prost earlier in the year, at the trophy presentation in December, he offered an olive branch and one of his helmets to Jean-Marie Balestre, who graciously accepted. The teams packed up in Adelaide, and pundits reflected on the season and looked forward to 1992, when Frank Wiliams and Patrick Head were quietly confident that they now had the car to beat the mighty McLarens.